Hey, what's going on with oil prices? They've been confusing. I've had to think about them a lot in the last year, not really by choice. Um, there's been a fuel shortage. The Strait of Hormuz has been closed for the last 4 or 5 months. Traffic had been between 100 and 120 vessels per day through there, and now it's somewhere between 0 and 20. So that's not great. Uh, at this point, we have about a 1.5 billion barrel deficit. We're doing a little better than the projection because we had a June that our reserves weren't growing, but they had almost flattened. And oil prices, meanwhile, have been very spiky, both up and down, which leads to a few obvious questions. How come it's so volatile if Hormuz has been closed the whole time? Why aren't oil prices even higher than they are? And when will things go back to normal? I'll answer those eventually. For now, there are a few topics to get through. So, first, I'll talk about how commodities are priced in general. Then, I'll give a baseline for oil in specific. So, that'll be pre war. I'll do one for during the war and one for after the war, even though we don't know when that'll be. Then, I'll talk about strategic petroleum reserves, what they are, what they do, and then what their limits are. Then I'll get into wartime stuff. So, why the Iran war is still going on, what are the forces that are kind of trying to end it, what are the forces that are kind of trying to keep it going. Um, and then I'll talk about Trump's effect specifically on markets before getting into my price estimates. These are not price targets. I'm not recommending that you buy below or sell above or whatever. Um, I'm just trying to, based on my own thinking here, trying to figure out what a fair kind of ballpark would be. Talking about pricing commodities for a bit, we'll start with actually pricing stocks. And I'll start with the discounted cash flow model, which is a way to estimate future expectations. Then I'll take a quick tangent to talking about interest rates and how those affect stock prices. In short, they shouldn't, at least at like not directly, but by making other investments more competitive, there are second order effects that happen to stocks. Then I'll talk about commodity prices and how they're different from stocks. In particular, when stocks are mostly about future expectations, commodity prices are mainly about physical reality. And the next biggest factor is our future expectations for that sector. Commodities, interestingly, are very cyclical and they tend to be on a supply side cycle. So, for example, if demand were to really increase, that would drive up prices, which would get a limited number of suppliers to build out their production lines. Um, that takes months or years. And then once those lines all come online, basically at the same time, because every company in the space is doing the same thing, then the prices will fall again because supply is caught up, kind of regardless of whether demand has remained high during that period of time. Anyway, then I'll get into specifically oil's factors, which includes what the physical reality is today, and then the future expectations. And then I'll talk a little bit about how other fuels and oil infrastructure is like what the outlook is there. But we'll start on stocks. So this is a discounted cash flow model, and this is for stocks rather than commodities. So this does not directly apply to oil. The first thing here are current earnings. So this is just a picture of health of the company right now, what it's doing, what markets it's in, how much money it earns. And it is basically accurate unless there is fraud going on. I don't mean this in like the legal sense of fraud. I mean this in like lying or obscuring whatever is happening, even if it is in a legal way. And so this will factor in what the company currently has, what it currently owes. But in general, this stuff is already priced in and the money has already been returned to owners. It doesn't really matter the mechanism by which this happens. Usually it's dividends or buybacks of stock. The next important factor is that you take these current earnings and you apply an expected growth rate to them. This is not an accurate fact that we can backtest because we don't have data for the future yet. However, it is a pretty educated guess based on what sector it's in, based on what products it offers, what its easy wins would be, or like what other companies exist in the space to compete with it. So this is an educated guess. Usually it's between 2 and 5%. Something that is dramatically above 5% is either super small or probably a bubble. It does happen occasionally, though. And in these cases, the big questions to ask when picking a growth rate are, can the company retain its market share based on its existing products? Like, can it fend off competition? And then another factor is, can it expand to new regions? Like, are there different products it could offer that would be kind of easy to develop? Are there different parts of the world? Like maybe you're running a regional company in one city, and there's another city that you could possibly expand to that could double your what's called total addressable market. And one thing that's really interesting about this is that people tend to assume a linear growth rate. That basically never happens, but it's often a good proxy. So, for example, if a stock is expected to grow at 2% a year, and the actual stock grows at 1% one year, 3% the next year, 2% the year after that, then you've effectively hit the growth rate, even though it hasn't been exactly as the model predicted. So in that case, you can get pretty close. And then lastly, companies don't last forever. They at some point will go out of business. At some point, you as an investor will cash out your money because you have a finite human lifespan. And so he set a terminal value. We only expect the company to grow based on current earnings for a few years, whether that's 5 or 10 or 20, whatever. This one is probably the most loosey-goosey of the bunch. It is a total guess as to what we think we could sell it for to somebody else. And so this just allows us to cap our growth at some finite number rather than extrapolate it infinitely. So here we get into the interest rate tangent, which is that previously in this setup, our growth expectations actually get higher over time. So our current earnings is usually expected to be the lowest point of the company's earnings. So over time, it gets more and more valuable. The issue is that if I were to give you $10 5 years from now, that would be worth a whole lot less than if I were to give you $10 today. And so we have to discount the future money that we expect to earn from the price. And so this is usually a percentage cut based on inflation, and then also based on how painful it is to have to wait for that money. So interest rates naturally affect that. They will lower our growth expectations if the cost of borrowing money rises, but they also lower the discount rate because they lower our expected inflation. And these are basically in parity. So the expected value of a stock should remain the same. However, stock prices will still fall, and that's for two reasons. One is that bonds get more competitive. So if I'm an investor and I have $100, I can invest those into stocks, I can invest those into bonds, or I can do some mix. And as interest rates rise, basically bond yields are rising as well. So the amount of money that you get paid back from that, and they're less volatile and things like that. So people will allocate more of their money towards bonds, usually taking that money out of stocks, which causes the prices to fall a little bit. The other major factor here is that bad companies rely on cheap debt. So these are often called zombie companies, but there are companies that don't really make money, or at least don't have a good business model. But the main thing that they do is they'll borrow in order to keep trucking. And they don't do a whole lot necessarily, but they will still employ people. And so the painful thing about these companies failing is that those people become unemployed and that people who own the stock will lose money. And that sucks. However, in the long term, it forces those former employees to do other things with their work. And these things are hopefully more productive, or at least for a better company, and things like that become more viable. And so the process of these bad companies surviving in a low interest rate environment is called zombie companies. And when these companies are forced to fail based on losing access to cheap capital, which would be what would happen in a high interest rate environment, that's called creative destruction. And it allows for new companies to enter this space based on vacuums that have been left by these bad companies failing. So a new startup might come along and say, hey, I think we can do this better, or I think we can do this with lower overhead. And that's great over the long term. It's very painful in the short term. It's important as well that stocks do tend to drop in price when people expect interest rates to rise, and they also tend to drop in price when interest rates actually rise. However, once they've dropped, they become competitive again versus bonds. So it's not as if the average stock becomes much worse when it drops in price. In this case, obviously, as an investor, you would lose money on the stock price going down. But then going forward, it would still be quite valuable at that price. Next, we'll talk about commodities. So commodities don't only have this kind of future expectation side of it, we also have the current day supply and demand. So on the top, we have our current like physical reality, and on the bottom, we have our future expectations. So first, we have to realize there's only so much of a commodity that can exist in circulation at any given time. And on the demand side, we use some of that up. We also have to consider how the supply chains are doing. So can it actually be traded among the people who have it and the people who want it? And on the demand side, we have to realize like certain commodities are replaceable. So, for example, in the food sector, rice, wheat, and corn can do a lot of the same things. So if rice prices were to rise pretty dramatically, that would tend to drive people to eat more wheat. And similarly, like some metals like gold are primarily a store of value and primarily for jewelry, but there are other precious metals like silver that are both of those things as well, but also an industrial metal. So when the price of silver goes up for reasons related to it as a store of value, it also gets that also affects industrial production, and so all of this machinery that takes silver will have to rise in price as well. In terms of our expectations here, we can take a look at supply chains from a going forward perspective, where like are these companies actually kind of reliably producing this stuff? Can this stuff like be sustained between producers over a long period of time? And then lastly, there's the topic of deferred maintenance. So we all basically realize that hey, roads take a lot to maintain, and it's actually cheapest to proactively go and fix the small things that are wrong with them before they become a big problem. But also, we don't do that because why would we fix a road if it's still working? And then eventually we get hit by a much bigger bill. And this is frequently something that happens in commodity spaces. If you're a mining company and you have a machine that really shouldn't be working, but still kind of does, you might as well just run it into the ground. Who cares, as long as it's still working? And that's usually not an active decision that gets made. Usually it's just people who kind of figure that they might as well still use it. On the expected demand side, we also have to factor in like what its actual uses are and whether those uses will remain popular or get more popular or less in the future. And we also have to consider whether it's replaceable. So, for example, diamonds have basically been grown in a lab in a way that's chemically identical. And so the ones that are mined by poorly paid people with terrible health standards are still scarce, but now we have a much more abundant and much cheaper form from labs. And a lot of diamond companies threatened by this have really pivoted into marketing in order to sort of pretend this isn't happening or to discredit the lab grown ones, as opposed to addressing the actual replaceability of it. So now we get to oil. There are actually many different kinds of oil. I'm highlighting two here. We're talking about Brent and we're talking about West Texas Intermediary, or WTI crude. We'll also talk briefly about refined petroproducts. So Brent is primarily from Persian Gulf states, so Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, the UAE, stuff like that. And West Texas Intermediary is from the US around the Permian Basin, around Texas, New Mexico, and Oklahoma. Both of them actually have similar traits. They are both, as far as it goes with oil, fairly light and fairly sweet. So these are two categorizations for oil. Light versus heavy refers to how easy it is to get from the ground and then to refine into gas. Sweet tends to refer to its sulfur content. I'm not a petro engineer. I have no idea how sulfur content affects anything, but apparently sweet oil is easier to refine. Both of these oil products are pretty convenient for refineries. They're not exactly the same and need different refinery equipment. So, for example, Brent crude is what Asian refineries specialize in because 80 to 90% of fuel in Asia is imported from the Middle East. Meanwhile, in the US, most refineries handle WTI, and it tends not to export very much crude WTI because it tends to be refined in the US first. However, despite only Brent crude being affected by the Iran war, it's also driven up prices for WTI because it is basically a replacement fuel. So, one fuel shortage creates all fuel shortages, basically. Um, just to give an example briefly of oil that would be considered heavy and sour, Venezuelan oil, I believe, is considered both. And it is possible to refine, it's just harder to and needs more specialized equipment. As far as refined petroproducts go, this is everything from jet fuel to diesel to regular gasoline to plastic. Um, the Iran war affects a whole bunch of different commodities as well. So that would be stuff like helium, that is mostly a byproduct, I believe, of LNG production, and also things like fertilizer. I believe that's potassium. Those are also things to worry about, but they're beyond the scope of this video. Especially fertilizer is something that is deeply worrying for basically the planet's carrying capacity of humans. Because if there's a 20% cut in the amount of fertilizer that we have, there's actually more like a 30% decrease in the amount of food that we grow. So things get pretty tough. Refined petroproducts are what you get after you refine the oil, and they have something called a crack spread, which is a pretty dumb name, but it's for what happens when you go from some amount of crude into some amount of a refined product. So say you take 3 barrels of crude oil and you turn them into 1 barrel of jet fuel, 2 barrels of gasoline, and a little bit of byproduct plastic. Then the crack spread would be the price difference between the stuff that you've produced versus the stuff that went in. So it's basically what the refinery makes from refining that barrel. So now we'll give a baseline on oil before the Iran war, which is that around 103 million barrels per day were in circulation, and around 103 million barrels were being used. There was a slight surplus of a few 100,000 barrels per day that was largely being stored by SPRs somewhere, and around 20%, so 20 to 21 million barrels per day, were from the Persian Gulf. The US is the largest single supplier of oil in the world. And also, Russian oil for the past 4 years has been sanctioned. So it would route either to China directly, which was its biggest buyer, or to India, which would relabel it and send it to Europe in order to dodge those sanctions. Iran basically has one buyer, and that's China. So it's pretty reliant. On the demand side, we use a little bit less than the amount that was produced pre-war. Asian countries, especially East Asian ones, import almost all of their energy, and also when it comes to how replaceable fuel is, the answer is it's largely replaceable, and a lot of electrical grids can handle different fuel types. That's kind of the point, right? So an internal combustion engine only ever takes gasoline, but if you drive an electric car, you're hooking up to whatever your plug gets on the input. So that could also just be gasoline, but it could be other fuel types. So it could be renewables, it could be coal even, it could be nuclear. And so that's largely true where, hey, is oil fungible? And the answer is somewhat yes, but it's also not true in specific cases. So things like jet fuel is only ever useful for planes, and planes basically only run on jet fuel. There's no other thing that they could take. As far as our expected supply and expected demand, we're expected to basically have things remain constant or slightly increase. And the reason for that is that oil infrastructure has not been maintained properly. We've been deferring maintenance on that for a really long time. Stuff is likely to break down. However, it's possible that Russian sanctions end. And that's unlikely when Vladimir Putin is in charge, but it is definitely true that Russia as a country, separate from Vladimir Putin, would benefit from a closer relationship with Europe, less dependence on China, things like that. And so it is possible that Putinless Russia could concede to Ukraine, at which point the sanctions could be lifted. The other thing that we knew going in is that Trump was deliberately affecting oil outside of the U.S. sphere of influence. So he embargoed Cuba, prevented Mexico and Venezuela and China from sending oil there, and he kidnapped Nicolas Maduro in order to seize control of Venezuelan oil. These are very fuel related international events, even before Iran. In terms of expected demand, oil demand has actually never shrunk, but it has always proportionally been shrinking relative to everything other than coal. So, especially today, renewables and nuclear are expected to be the future, and that is expected to dominate more and more of the energy market going forward. Um, Also, our overall, like, if you're saying, hey, the pie is what it is and oil's share of the pie is shrinking, we do believe that the pie will continue to grow, based on AI's energy demands, which are very high. So, a fair question: how replaceable is oil? Can you replace it with some other fuel? And the answer is yes, in electrical grids, no for certain types of machines. Like, for example, an internal combustion engine car is not fungible. An electric vehicle is. Basically, the way to think about it is that if it plugs in, then you can replace it. If it doesn't plug in and takes fuel directly, then you can't. I'll take a quick tangent as well to talk about climate, because this is inextricably linked with oil. First, in primary and secondary markets, your impact on the climate when you're trading things relating to oil becomes very different. So, for example, if I were to trade an oil future or to buy or sell an oil company stock, that would not have any impact on that company or its decision making process. However, if I were to decide whether to lend that company money or decide whether to invest in a renewable energy company in the first place, or things like that, those all affect the primary market, which is the company itself as opposed to just another trader. And so those would have an effect on their decision making. So, for example, if an oil company tries to do something terrible for the climate and people were to deny them corporate bonds, then that would make it prohibitively expensive and they wouldn't be able to do that. It is very important that people choose responsible things in order to reduce the effect of climate change. These are largely big ticket items, like basically whether you eat beef, whether you fly, how much waste you produce, things like that. This is actually a pretty small proportion of climate change. It's maybe 10 to 20%, where business decisions, particularly at the industrial scale, are way more important. And so these like massive supply chains and these, primarily oil companies or companies that like spend a ton of fuel running data centers, things like that, that's really the bulk of fuel consumption. And they will spend a lot of money on marketing and things like that to have you focus on your own personal responsibility. So oil companies actually love it when you do things like go, ugh, I should recycle more, because it means that they don't have to take responsibility for their part of things. And their part is way bigger, like orders of magnitude larger than you or I. And so really, as much as this is like a personal responsibility thing and people can be doing better usually, it is mostly an institutional issue of forcing our systems to prevent companies from acting really poorly. In general, most people want to replace oil as a fuel source pretty quickly, and most companies want to delay it as long as possible. Now, tangent over, let's talk about the Iran war. When the Strait of Hormuz closed, we lost about 20 million barrels a day. That's supposed to say per day, not today. However, about 7 million of those barrels were rerouted along the Saudi Petroline from the east coast to the west coast, and that takes them to the Red Sea, where they can either exit through the Suez Canal or through the Bab al-Mandab Strait. Also, the UAE has about 2 million barrels per day that it has a pipeline routed around Hormuz as well. Countries have also been releasing reserve barrels of oil from strategic petroleum reserves, or SPRs. So China is not part of the International Energy Association. Countries within that group have been releasing around 2.7 million barrels per day, And China has been releasing at least 3 million barrels per day, maybe up to 5. It's hard to tell. They don't publish figures, and also they don't export to other countries. So all of the oil that is being released from Chinese reserves stays and is used in China. Lastly, Russian exports have slowed, and this is because of Ukrainian drone strikes on Russian oil production, refineries, and shipping ports. We don't know how much damage that has caused. Really, it's too early to even have estimates. But they have been struck, and oil has been short in Russia. So they've been restricting it from civilian use and putting it more towards military. They've been exporting less, things like that. On the demand side, there has been demand destruction, especially among poor countries like Sri Lanka, African countries, a lot of South Asian countries. The big result is that Asian countries have switched a lot to using coal, and over time, there is a push to get slowly towards renewables. That'll take a while. Um, Kind of medium wealth areas have been buying a little bit less oil, although not super significantly less. But that's basically what happens when you decide not to take a trip by car that you normally would based on oil prices being high. Then we can look at expected demand and expected supply. Expected supply is really dominated by the question of when will Hormuz open again. And then there's another point to it, which is that, hey, once SPRs run out, or if they run out, then the daily deficit basically doubles. So right now, the daily deficit is between 4 and 5 million barrels per day. With SPRs out, that is anywhere between 7.5 and like 12. It really depends on whether you count China and a whole bunch of other factors. But the optimistic answer would be that, hey, at that point, we would be at a 7.5 million barrel per day deficit. And the pessimistic answer would be we'd be at a 12 million barrel per day deficit. Really, it should be somewhere in the middle. On the expected demand side, countries have taken this as a really strong catalyst to start building out nuclear and renewable power systems. And this is not due to climate change concerns. Countries have for 50 years been talking about climate change. This is more an issue of sovereignty. They want to rely less on global supply chains, and in particular, they want to be less vulnerable to the whims of other countries, especially America. Otherwise, expected demand is unchanged. So, in a hypothetical after Iran war economy, and I don't know when this will be, we're assuming that oil from the Gulf states will be back in circulation. We'll assume that nothing really changes on the Russian side. It's possible that things change, but it's pretty unrelated to the Iran war, so who knows? There are possible tolls that might be in place on oil coming out of the Gulf if Iran is successful in its negotiations. And there's some amount of Gulf infrastructure that has been destroyed. Banks typically estimate around 1 million barrels per day. However, other countries have ramped up production during the war. As they've seen oil prices rise and as they've seen Middle Eastern oil drop off, it's become more profitable for other oil producers to do a little bit more. So we'll say that the supply is probably down 1 million barrels per day for at least the medium term after the war ends. On the demand side, nothing really changes other than that strategic petroleum reserves will want to refill before the next crisis, and that countries that have transitioned to coal as a response to high oil prices will now transition back from coal towards oil and LNG. On the expected supply side, eventually over the long term, like 3 to 5 years out, we can expect oil production to be higher than ever before, and we can also expect demand to stagnate or roughly shrink. So over time, we do genuinely expect oil prices to fall and stagnate and get lower. The issue is that isn't going to happen immediately, even if the Iran war were to end. So the big question on all of this is that nobody knows when Hormuz will reopen or under which rules. So it's possible that the US quote unquote wins and it gets to impose international law on the Strait of Hormuz. It's possible that Iran quote unquote wins and it gets to control the waterway, or it remains closed, or whatever. Because we have pretty nebulous expectations on when this thing reopens, every day of war that doesn't open the Strait of Hormuz should loosely push back our expectations of when it reopens by about 1 day. It's not exactly one to one, but it should pretty much be. Talking specifically about the SPRs, or Strategic Petroleum Reserves. Mm. So there are some reserves that are held by countries, and these are countries in the International Energy Association, or IEA. Um, Mostly countries that rely on imported oil, they'll store a buffer of it, and this is the exact kind of emergency that they are being used or being held for. So, like, this is the purpose of them, this is why they exist, they've been doing their job. However, we can't totally empty these reserves. For example, pre war, the US had around 450 million barrels in its reserves. It can't go below 190 ish. And the reason for that is kind of threefold. One is that the stuff at the bottom of these literal caves are like the sludgiest stuff that is basically unusable. Um, and then also, reason two is that if you withdraw from these caves too deeply or too often, they might start to collapse. They were originally set up around 50 years ago, and they were estimated to take about 5 withdrawals. So far, they've taken 10. So they really could collapse at any time. But also, they haven't so far. So who really knows? And then, thirdly, a lot of the actual oil that's in there is reserved for specific uses. The biggest case, at least in the US, is for the US military. So it's not as if all of the oil is for public consumption. Then there are also company specific oil reserves. So in Japan, they require that each company keeps 200 days of whatever fuel it uses on hand in case of a crisis like this. And so these are prolific. A lot of companies will just have them even if they're not required to. And some companies will report how much they have in reserves, but it's very hard to consistently track over time because they don't report at the same interval. They don't report all the same numbers. It might have, like, some companies haven't released numbers since the Iran war started, things like that. But in general, there are companies that have reserves. We just don't totally know how much is in there or how many days they have remaining. Now let's talk about China. China is not part of the IEA, but they do have more oil in reserves than at least the top 10 members of the IEA combined. However, they don't export that oil. So they are dipping into their reserves. They have been using millions of barrels per day of that, but it has been for domestic consumption and domestic industry within China. They do not publish amounts, and I believe that this is at least partially because they import a lot of sanctioned oil at a discount, and it would be pretty awkward to announce that to the world. Lastly, we'll talk about the total deficit so far in the war. We have withdrawn about 1.5 billion barrels total since the war started. We were expected to have a surplus this year of like 500 or 600 million barrels. That has obviously not materialized and obviously cannot at this point. And one thing that's really interesting is that people's expectations on the future, right, of like when will this war end, those fluctuate pretty wildly day by day based on political announcements. But it doesn't change the fact that the Strait of Hormuz has been closed pretty much the whole time, and that the situation basically gets worse. Every single day of this war, the deficit has grown. It might have only grown a little bit, but it has always grown every single day. And so we're in this awkward position of, hey, what if SPRs run out? First point is that they won't all run out at the same time. Some companies will have their SPRs run out first, and then some countries will have theirs run out. China will probably be fine for at least 100 more days or something like that. Pretty unclear, again, because they don't publish any numbers on that. When they do, the daily deficit would grow from around 5 million barrels per day to at least 7.5 million barrels per day. And the issue is that some part of oil prices are current reality, and another part are their future expectations. However, the sharper the deficit, the more the prices have to actually reflect what's happening, right? Like if we only have 5 barrels of oil, there's not much future we can expect from that. They're all going to be used very shortly, and so we're going to be paying the current prices as opposed to the future prices. And so basically, the lower SPRs are, or particularly if they run out, we are going to be forced away from future expectations and towards current reality. One important note is that after the war, these SPRs will have to be restocked because these countries have obviously just seen, hey, we've had a massive oil crisis. Um, this is the sort of thing that may not happen again tomorrow, but is very likely to happen again at some point. And then lastly, once SPRs have run out, governments lose their political tooling in order to affect oil prices one way or another, because oil won't be owned by the government as much anymore, and they won't be a seller. The next question is, will they run out? And the short answer is yes. SPRs are basically a reservoir, and there's a flow of oil that goes into that, and that flow of oil has been cut off a ways upstream. And so even if Hormuz were to open soon and its flow were to be restored pretty quickly, we would still hit a point where the reservoir was totally empty before it would start to refill. So, SPRs currently are at their lowest point since 1979. Even if the strait were to resume its flow, it would take weeks in order to ship any oil to get to Asia or Europe. Also, the flow wouldn't totally resume that quickly. There are delays. So, these delays are the shipping time, 3 to 5 weeks, in order for the boats to transit to the refineries in the continents where they are destined to arrive. Then there's also risk insurance for boats. So risk insurance pre-war was at something like 0.5% or 15 basis points of the boat's value plus its cargo. Now it's at between 3.5 and like 5%. And that's because it's very uncertain. There's some risk that these boats will simply blow up and things like that. And it's really not clear how risky it is. So in the meantime, insurance companies are forced to put an uncertainty premium, which is different from the risk premium of like how actually likely is it to blow up. And that uncertainty is very likely to last until the end of the war plus 2 to 14 months. So up to a year after the war, these shipping companies will be paying like 4% of their shipping costs to an insurance company just to transit through this one strait. And even if the strait were to reopen, it sort of takes the genie out of the bottle. We know that it is possible for Iran to blow up ships in the strait. We know it's possible for them to close the strait again. So that premium is more realized than it was pre-war, and it will never go away fully. Lastly, a lot of the issues so far have been that Iran makes certain demands on ships that go through the Strait of Hormuz, and the US makes certain demands on international shipping. And it is impossible for a ship to comply with both the Iranian standards and to the US standards, which is pretty tough. So they basically have to choose who to comply with. With Iran, they risk blowing up. And with the US, they risk being sanctioned or the oil being confiscated or losing their shipping license, things like that. As far as the oil infrastructure in the Middle East, a lot of it has had to be turned off, and that damages its capacity. This requires repair that may take months, and that's separate from the infrastructure that has been blown up and like the refineries that have been totally destroyed, which will take 2 to 3 years to rebuild. So it is true that 2 to 3 years after the war, things will basically be back to normal in most ways. But that's still a long time, and there's still a lot of oil to get through before then. However, to counterbalance that, right now there are about 400 ships currently ready to cross the strait when it reopens, which is about 4 days worth of pre-war inventory. During the June MOU, there was a week where there were between 3 and 4 million barrels per day going through the strait, which is fairly good. It's about 20% of the pre-war average. Now let's talk about a ship's individual decision, because there are 4 decision makers here, kind of 5. First is the crew. They primarily face a downside risk of, hey, if you go through the Strait of Hormuz and the boat sinks, then you are going to die. And so as a result, kind of the most they can do is demand higher pay, and then they could also refuse to sail the boat and get off and leave. From the boat owner's perspective, they get a huge upside risk of, hey, if this works out, there is a ton of oil on board this boat that can be sold at a higher price. However, they must remain compliant to Iranian law in order to avoid being blown up, including the boat that they own. And they also must obey international law, kind of US law, in order to keep their shipping license. So the boat owner mostly has upside. Then the insurance company mostly has the downside again, where if the boat blows up, the insurance company has to pay up and replace it. Their level of risk is really unknown, and due to the uncertainty, it's really spiked. Even if the war were to end, that uncertainty would continue for many months. Then, from the governmental perspective, this is the part where Iran and the US both want to impose some level of control over these ships, even if they aren't actively attacking them. And so these contradictory rules really, really hurt a ship's decision-making process. You basically are forced to take a side. Now, just as a quick recap on the Iran war, as we get into the war side of the politics, the events here are that the US attacked Iran on February 28th or March 1st. And this was because Israel wanted regional dominance. They convinced Trump to assassinate Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. When they did, it was partially because Iran's regime was very unpopular. This has since reversed. Since Trump has gotten involved and started bombing Iran, Iran has really galvanized against Israel and against the US, and has really calcified its existing regime, even though pre-war its regime was very unpopular. The reason for these strikes was in large part because Iran has been sort of toying with the idea of building nuclear bombs for the last 10 or 20 years, and they're mostly wanting it as a deterrent. They see themselves as a regional power, and they want to be able to stand up to outside empires. Over the years, Iran has been invaded by Russia, they've been invaded by England, they've been contested between Nazi Germany and England, and they've had coups and governments installed by the US as well. So Iran primarily is looking for independence, and to be able to resist outside empires, where the US is the outside empire trying to impose its will. So until Iran has nukes, which it would use as a deterrent, its main threat has been that they would close oil shipping. Now, it's important to note that the US attack against Iran basically worked. They destroyed a lot of military targets, and they killed Iran's previous supreme leader. They also killed tons of civilians, famously bombed a girls' school, things like that. Really horrific stuff. And in response, Iran actually did close the Strait of Hormuz, which was seen as a possibility, but not something that the US had actually accounted for. So Iran is able to attack ships, and they do so from the mountains north of the Strait of Hormuz. This should say Hormuz, not Iran. And they do so with drones, mines, and patrol boats. Because oil tankers are flammable based on the oil that they carry, they're really big and they're really slow. So it's really easy to hit them, and then they tend to totally blow up. Whereas from the US side, in order to prevent those attacks, it costs a lot more. And in order to do that, you'd either have to totally change the regime in Iran and totally destroy its military, or have it be replaced organizationally with somebody open to peace, or you'd have to physically control those mountains by having your own military bases, and that would require a full-scale ground invasion, full war. And currently, the Iran war is something that Trump has done without the approval of Congress, which is not how that's supposed to work, but it is how it has worked. And then another option would be to individually provide air covers for each tanker that passes, which is insanely expensive. It would be millions of dollars per boat. Lastly, the most effective thing that has been tried so far was actually a further blockade. So ships would go through the Strait of Hormuz, and then they'd run into a US Navy blockade outside, where they would basically prevent Iranian ships from carrying oil to China. This cut off Iran's money, while the rest of the world also had the blockade going. So let's talk about the three players in this war. There's the US, there's Iran, and there's Israel. The US started the war in the first place. They are also basically seen as responsible for opening the Strait of Hormuz. They're the reason it closed. Um, and they have been seen as the protector of global trade. If they can't manage to get this open, that would be a huge blow to their reputation as like a global insurer and as their role as like a military that supports other countries. So the main goal in the war at this point, and the U.S. would be so happy if this happened, is just to open the Strait of Hormuz, which is crazy because it was open before the war. um, their second goal is to prevent Iran from getting nukes. Um, they may or may not succeed. It seems unlikely. They seem to have basically conceded that in recent negotiations. They're also on the fence about regime change. And then the other thing about this is that even if the US were to promise either sanctions relief or monetary aid or to like a ceasefire or whatever, it is very likely that the US turns around and attacks Iran again. And this is basically in part because Trump sees Iran as political tools. He does not respect the country. And it's partially because um, the US has many reasons to be afraid of Iran. Lastly, the US mostly doesn't want to be there. Most voters don't understand or don't support the war with Iran. Trump is very unpopular. They see gas prices going up. It's not as if many Americans have died in this war. I want to say the military casualties have been around 7, and there just aren't any civilians who from the U.S. side who have died. But still, the U.S. really hates this war. It has all of the same traits of the Vietnam War of being a pointless fight that they really shouldn't be involved with, um, while also like it. I mean, it's very clear that the U.S. is the bad guy, and also that they messed things up globally for everyone else. So it's very unpopular, and the US has what I'll call low pain tolerance. Iran, by contrast, has been hit much harder by the US. Way more people have died in Iran. Water desalination plants that support 10 to 15,000 people have been struck on purpose, which is a crazy human rights violation. But despite this, Iran hasn't conceded because they have negotiation leverage. And so they're willing to be struck as long as it preserves their own sovereignty. And so their main goal in this is to resist foreign influence. Their main want is that they have been affected by sanctions for many decades. And if they were to get sanctions relief, that would really help them tremendously. Right now, they sell most of their stuff to China and get most of their funding from China. It would really help them out to have support from other countries. So in a lot of ways, Iran exists as a proxy state for China in the Middle East because most major empires in the world have a proxy state in the Middle East, like the U.S. has the proxy state of Israel in the Middle East. So one thing that's very interesting about Iran is that under the supreme leader, there is sort of a democratically elected part of its administration, and there's also kind of theocratic. Like religious authoritarian side of it as well. So that includes the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, or IRGC. And in general, the country has been split between pragmatic approach that says, hey, if they offer us a really good deal, we should take it because that's a lot of money and we'll stop getting bombed, at least for a little bit. And then there's a side that says, hey, the violence that has been inflicted on us has been senseless and evil, and we should get revenge. And so, in general, the Iranian parliament and elected leaders are open to negotiation, while the IRGC generally wants revenge. And they're not satisfied, even if they were to, quote, win the negotiations, they want revenge. On the Israeli side, they want dominance in the Middle East, and it is crucial for them that the war resolves in total defeat for Iran. They are not willing to accept a ceasefire, and so as a result, they've been actively sabotaging peace talks, negotiations, and U.S. plans. And this has been very frustrating for everyone everywhere outside of Israel. So they are, in a lot of ways, a proxy state for the U.S., in a lot of ways, it's a tail wagging the dog situation where Israel does what it wants and the U.S. is forced to adapt to them. But they're really desperate for the war to continue. They also are already committed to several military endeavors. So they are fighting Hezbollah in Lebanon, and they're committing genocide in Palestine. They also are currently a nuclear power, and they're still afraid of Iran getting nukes, because that would change the power dynamic. One thing that's very interesting about Israel is that among people in the West, so America, especially North America, and Europe, Israel is very popular among people 60 or 65 and older. And they're very unpopular among people below 60. And I really think that this has a lot to do with when the Israeli state was established, kind of the presence of World War II in people's minds, and then also just how Israel has been treating the world over the past 10 or 15 years. I'll talk about the MOU briefly, the Memorandum of Understanding. It had extremely favorable terms for Iran, especially about money, and it basically allowed them to self-police on nukes, which means not at all. The US is mainly desperate to just get back to where it was. The issue, though, is that both sides were not really loyal to the deal. The IRGC operated totally separately from the parliamentary leaders who negotiated the peace on the Iran side. And then Trump feels like he can basically strike Iran whenever, as long as it's convenient for him. And so Israel and the IRGC really want to escalate. Trump, on a personal level, wants to escalate, but he's also very wary of the US voter who wants peace and the war to just end. So Trump, in general, wants to just sort of like drop this, like throw his hands up and walk away. Whereas the primary peacemakers in this situation are the Iranian parliament, as well as like Asian countries would love peace, as well as Europeans, and especially European business leaders and governments. And over the war, we've had over 50 fake peace announcements. I want to say by the time the MOU was signed, there had been like 37 announcements, and since then there have been at least 15 more. One of the interesting parts about this is that the war has often been talked about as happening on the weekends, because Trump only wants to strike when markets are closed to avoid a negative impact on the stock market. And then Iran, for their side, doesn't want to provoke the US when they're already not attacking. So they are willing to abide by this sort of implicit ceasefire, so in order to avoid being struck. Trump, in general, is desperate for the war to end based on midterms, and then also in order to protect the image of the US as the global hegemon, by protecting shipping lanes and showing that it's capable of opening the strait again. Now we'll talk about insider trading, which is another form of market manipulation. The big spike is when Trump posts an announcement and there is a little spike of somebody insider trading it about 15 minutes in advance. This is a very clear example. We don't know exactly who that was, but we do know that there have been insiders trading this. Before we can talk about the insiders, though, let's talk about oil futures, which are a contract to buy oil at a certain price in the future, which means that they are highly leveraged. Basically, the thing that you're putting down is only the insurance deposit that kind of allows you to trade this in the future, but you're also locked in and forced to trade it. So it is fundamentally a zero-sum game where if you are right about something, then the other person was wrong, and your profit is matched by their loss. In terms of how contracts get resolved, they can either be sold to the next person, or you can settle them with the counterparty for money, or they can be resolved physically by the delivery of oil. Only about 5% of them are actually physically delivered, even though about 40 to 50% of oil futures traders are the people hedging risks. So that would be airlines, fuel refiners, anything that takes a lot of fuel wants to hedge against oil prices swinging massively in one direction or another. However, they mostly are using it as a risk insurance tool, so even they don't necessarily need oil to be physically delivered. Then the other 50 to 60% of the market are speculators who are seeking to profit. So they have a positive expected return where the hedgers have a slightly negative expected return. However, this is a transfer of risk. So basically, if you're an airline, you are accepting that you're taking an average loss most of the time, But in return, you are offloading your risk to some Wall Street guy who usually will make a bit of money and then sometimes will lose a lot of money. That's the idea. However, in this context, we've seen a lot of insider trading. And so on one side of a trade, you have literally Barron Trump or Jared Kushner or Steve Witkoff, who are the negotiators for the US and Israel. I've also represented the rest of the Trump administration using Don Jr., Eric Trump, and Howard Lutnick. It really could be anyone, though. Hard to say which of bald conservative man in suit has been the one doing it. But in the case of Barron Trump specifically, we know that he got 10 future trades exactly correct, like same day in a row. And that is statistically impossible, not just improbable, impossible. It's like 1 in like a trillion or something. On the other side of these trades, usually, are professional oil trading firms or like divisions in a bank. And so they'll pay teams of experts, of like people with master's degrees and PhDs, who dedicate their whole careers to this stuff of tracking inventories, pricing risks, like totally understanding this commodity from the top to the bottom. And because this is a zero-sum thing, they're usually seeking to profit a little bit off of the hedgers, but it's very common for them to lose money to each other. And that's based on unexpected events. That's just the risk working. It's nothing to be alarmed by. However, based on Barron Trump's 10 in a row, or the obvious insider trading that we've seen, it's become very clear that these are experts who have the best means of solving a puzzle, but they're going up against somebody who has had this puzzle solved for them in advance. And so if you're a like major bank paying a team of experts and you're still losing $50 to $100 million on these trades, based on basically illegal information being used against you, you're just going to stop trading because you know, like, hey, we did the best we could with the information we had, but they just had more information. And so it's not as if oil prices have necessarily cratered, but the trading volume of oil futures has actually cratered since insider trading became so obvious in late April and mid-May. And so most of these professional oil traders who are usually in the market have stepped back because they just don't want to face off against these people who already know the answer. The issue with the market manipulation, other than the ethics and the legality of it, is that it doesn't fix the problem. We don't have enough oil. We have an oil shortage. The problem is not the price. And so as we market manipulate, we detach further and further from reality, which creates artificially low prices. And that means that demand doesn't drop as much as it should, which means that later on we'll run out of oil faster. And that means that demand will have to fall even further, right? Like it makes the situation worse in the future. It also means that the countries that are selling their petroleum reserves are getting less money for their oil, which is a cost to them. And it also deters other countries, so for example, Canada or like Australia with its coal, from expanding their supply because if oil prices are lower, then that means that their margin wouldn't be as high. So these companies could decide to expand, but if the price is artificially low, they may not decide to do that. However, this will eventually be forced back to reality. I don't know how, I don't know when. It'll probably take an event for that to be the case, but at some point, the market manipulation will have to run out because this is weird stuff going on about the future, and we've seen oil jump or drop by 10% in a day, but fundamentally, the whole time, we've been increasing our deficit. And so now let's answer our original questions. Why is it so volatile if Hormuz has been closed the whole time? And that is an effect of the strategic petroleum reserves working as intended. They are intended to be a shield from global events like this, and they have been. The issue is that once the SPRs run out, then we will be forced to deal with whatever we get at that point. And it is likely to be a much worse scenario than we have. So we have been shielded, and that shield is running out. However, most major institutions do agree that oil prices should probably be higher than they are right now. They just don't want to fall victim to the market manipulation that is obviously happening. So that brings us to our next question. Why aren't prices even higher? The SPRs give us a buffer, and that allows us to spend more of our energy trading on future expectations rather than physical reality. As these run out, we will start to move towards the physical reality side of things. The other part is that nobody knows when Hormuz will open. A lot of banks tend to be pretty optimistic. They say, according to some equity analyses that I've read, as recently as early July, they expect the Strait of Hormuz to be open 80 to 90% by September. So that to me seems pretty optimistic. I don't think that that is as likely as 60% personally, but it's definitely possible. Ultimately, nobody knows what'll happen with it. Another important factor is that historically, oil has been more expensive than it is, or than it was before the war. And that's just due to inflation. Like if you were to go back to 2000, oil was, I want to say, between $25 and $35 a barrel. And pre-war, it was between $70 and $55 a barrel. But we've had massive inflation since then. Other commodities have gone up by 4 to 6 times in price in that same time period. So once you account for inflation, oil prices pre-war had been actually really cheap, and that's just based on demand for other fuel types growing, and so oil is a larger share of the pie. So oil is less relevant today than it ever has been. However, this is also the biggest oil supply crunch that we've ever had. So those two things are in tension. And the other factor is that while crude oil futures are kind of cheap relative to what you'd expect, physical oil today is actually expensive. If you were trying to get an actual barrel today, it would cost a lot of money, and the same is true for refined fuel. To answer our last question, when will things go back to normal? The first answer is that Trump does not have control over the war. He really wants this shit to be over, and it is not. And the issue is that if Iran wins the negotiations, then shipping insurance and tolls will both become regular realities and will add costs to all fuel. So now let's get into pricing scenarios. We'll talk optimistically at the start. We'll say, hey, what if the Strait of Hormuz were to open today, and that ship traffic gradually increases over a month until it reaches about 80% of its pre-war traffic. In this scenario, strategic petroleum reserves are still depleted, and we run out of our reservoir until the oil tankers arrive again. So this would provide like a really short period of time where there is simply not enough oil before it restores. Well, we will assume that tolls and insurance will slow shipping, so it won't quite reach 100%, not for a long time. However, there's still the uncertainty here attached to, hey, could they just close the strait again? And that is a possibility. The genie is never fully going back in the bottle on that one. As far as infrastructure damage, we'll take some optimistic estimates on these as well. We'll say there's only 1 million barrels per day worth of oil supply equipment destroyed in the Gulf, and we'll say there's about 500,000 destroyed in Russia. We'll also say that the Bab al-Mandab Strait remains open. We haven't talked about that yet. We will. So in this optimistic scenario, we have shipping traffic resuming to about 80%, and we have oil flow down about 1 million barrels per day from pre-war. The physical reality for the price here, and this is just based on having to refill the SPRs, is around $98 per barrel. However, this would be tempered by the fact that our future expectations are still that oil becomes less important in the future. So actual oil prices are likely to be a little lower than this, but not necessarily by much. Now we'll talk about the pessimistic scenario where the strait remains closed and the war doesn't resolve because Iran doesn't trust Trump and Trump does not want to admit defeat. In this scenario, the SPRs are depleted, and so we're looking at an additional 6 million barrel per day deficit there, as well as increased infrastructure damage because our scenario is less optimistic here. So the permanent damage from disuse and bombings would be at 3 million barrels per day in the Gulf. It's probably not currently at 3 million barrels per day, but this is also just from disuse of the oil heads. And the longer the war lasts, obviously, the more bombs get dropped in that region in general. We'll call the Ukrainian damage to Russian infrastructure at around 1 million barrels per day. And then we'll talk a bit about the Bab el Mandeb. Here I have it marked down as a 3 million barrel per day bump. So the issue with the Bab el Mandeb is that it is on the other side of the Arabian Peninsula, and it connects the Red Sea to the Gulf of Aden. And so the issue with it is that when Saudi Arabia rerouted 5 million barrels per day away from Hormuz towards the Red Sea, that oil is all going through the Bab el Mandeb now. So in total, it's transporting around 7 or 8 million barrels per day. However, Houthis in Yemen have been frustrated with Saudi Arabia for a long time, and they've recently decided to attack Saudi Arabia. This is largely separate from the war between Iran and the US and Israel. The Houthis are sometimes seen as a proxy group for Iran, but the reasons for attacking Saudi ships in this instance are somewhat different grievances than the war in Iran. This could remove up to 8 million barrels per day once you include the Petroline traffic. However, it's probably not going to be that bad, both because the Houthis in Yemen don't have as many resources to close the straits, even though it is fairly cheap to do so. And also because the Suez Canal is an alternative. However, it's a very inconvenient one because most of the traffic coming out of the Persian Gulf and from the Red Sea ends up in Asia. And the issue with going through the Suez Canal is that all of a sudden now you have to sail through the Mediterranean all the way down the coast of Africa, past Cape Horn, and all the way back up. And so this increases the travel time from 3 to 5 weeks all the way up to maybe 10 weeks, as well as increasing the fuel costs proportionally and things like that. There are also conflicts happening in other parts of the Middle East that are fairly close to the Suez Canal. So right now there's major conflict in Lebanon, there's conflict in Palestine, there may even be some conflict in Libya. I want to also briefly touch on Venezuela as a potential source for more oil, because they do have huge untapped reserves. The issue is that companies have been reluctant to build there because every time they have, when the Venezuelan regime has confiscated their infrastructure or forced them out for other reasons, they've lost that investment. So they've been burned before, they're pretty unwilling to show up again. The US takeover hasn't really changed things on the ground. It basically leaves Marco Rubio as the de facto governor of Venezuela, and money has been the main effect of this. Instead of going to a corrupt Venezuelan regime, it's going to corrupt US individuals and companies held in Qatar. Also, Venezuela has recently been the victim of magnitude 7 earthquakes that have destroyed something like 30% of all infrastructure in the country, meaning that the country is likely to focus massively on fixing its cities and civilian things before it focuses on expanding oil production. So in this pessimistic scenario, we'll say that about 20% of ship traffic, so that's equivalent to under the June MOU, goes through the Strait of Hormuz daily, so around 4 million barrels per day of oil. But also that oil flow is severely hampered by SPRs running out and by other conflicts. So the Bab el Mandeb and Russian infrastructure and SPRs and all that stuff. So in this case, the price of Brent would very reasonably be above 150. I don't have an exact price for this. The point of a scenario like this is just to say that it's bad. It would cause a recession. It would cause the value of money relative to oil to go down even further, just as people trust dollars less. Now I have 2 slides of conclusions here. First is that in both of these scenarios, in the optimistic and pessimistic one, I'm using the physical reality to determine the price. The issue with that is that it is almost always going to be higher than the future expectation price because oil demand is expected to fall long term. So does oil have to refill the SPRs? Yes. Is oil severely restricted right now? Yes. Is oil important right now? Yes. But it is not expected to be into the future. So over the long term, it is a falling commodity, and everyone knows it. Next, When the SPRs run out, the issue is that market manipulation will fail because there simply won't be enough oil for us to meet our basic demands. SPRs are like a reservoir. Hormuz determines oil flows, but it is pretty far upstream, so it is possible for the reservoir to have totally emptied, even if there is flow that will eventually come in. As far as the conflict goes, Israel and the IRGC are pretty unlikely to back down. They both seem to want to escalate, even if other people on their side want to de escalate. And so it really comes down to, can the Iranian parliament control its military, and can the US control Israel? I believe the answer is no. You also have to think about the other oil supply chains, so Russia and oil from the Red Sea. Those are also risky right now. And as far as bank estimates, they seem pretty optimistic right now in terms of when the Strait of Hormuz will open. They seem pretty confident that it will have opened a month ago, all the way up to opening before September. And I think that it is less likely than they do. I could be wrong about that, though. Lastly, we have to talk about oil futures, which are sort of like the closest we can get to expectations on oil, but they've been somewhat ruined based on corruption, and that's disincentivized honest traders who simply have expertise in the field from showing up and trading for profit because they know that they are going to lose to someone with knowledge that they shouldn't have who is also trying to trade for profit. So it's a weird scenario. It's hard to feel bad for commodities traders, but in this case, they've sort of managed it. And lastly, my conclusions from this is that oil prices should probably be higher than where they are, but it is going to be volatile. Mainly, this is actually a call for other countries to devote more of their resources into switching away from oil as quickly as possible. So, sovereign sources like nuclear and renewables. And then the last kind of obvious point is that the Iran war was dumb, and it's always been dumb. Trump obviously wanted a political win like he got with Venezuela, where he in one day managed to kidnap its leader. In this case, he did successfully assassinate Ayatollah Ali Khamenei in one night, but he then set up this sort of impossible to escape from trap. It seemed like part of the point was to deny oil outside of the US sphere of influence, like I talked about, and to consolidate it among countries that the US considers allies or puppets. And then also, while we've only been talking about oil in this, there's been a lot of suffering attached to this war. Thousands of people have died, especially on the Iranian side, somewhat on the US side, and then I want to say a little bit of the Israeli military. Ultimately, the point of all of this is fuck Trump, fuck Israel. They've obviously been making decisions that have been bad for the world. All right. Thank you for listening.